for the extreme today. We're happy for states, when they're engaged in big wars, large-scale war, conventional wars, to desecrate the sites, religious importance to the countries that they are directly opposing within that war. We say they can graffiti them, they can piss in the fonts, they can remove icons, they can dance in the streets with the corpses of saints, just like in the Spanish Civil War. And we're going to show you, on this side, why it's legitimate. Firstly, I'm going to show you why it helps to win the war. Secondly, I'm going to show you why states that engage in war consent to this action. Thirdly, I'm going to show you why it is legitimate to desecrate these particular sites. And Lizzie, because she's so clever, is going to show you why, in the long term, it reduces extreme acts in war. Firstly, though, an important point of clarification. We do not have to show you that desecration should be used in all wars, in all circumstances. What we do have to show you is that it is a legitimate tactic in war which may be used if those countries want it to be used. But insofar as we're happy to accept this desecration, we're happy for it to be used relatively widely. So firstly, why does it help to win war? Well, firstly we say it demoralises the enemy. These are sites which do, for whatever historical and ridiculous division between sacred and profane reason, have some kind of importance to the societies that hold them. We say desecrating those sites, ridiculing those sites, dancing with the corpses of their saints in the streets, demoralises the enemies. It takes something which is at the core of many of those people's identities and says, we are going to attack it. You are going to be beaten. And that kind of demoralisation is incredibly powerful. Secondly, we say that it makes enemies who we are fighting focus on protecting those sites. That means they're less concerned with protecting their own forces. That makes it slightly easier to win the war. Thirdly, after we've desecrated them, pissed in the font and whatever, we said have to spend a lot more time defending those sites, spending their resources, ensuring that these holy sites aren't desecrated. And that costs them resources and time and logistical support. Finally, we say that in many ways, it undercuts a lot of the crazy lunatic extremist rhetoric within things. If you stand up and say, well, look, you know, the mosque is still standing, it hasn't been touched, that means God supports our cause. With the corpses of saints, we say God probably wasn't watching very carefully. So that's why we think it's helpful for winning the war. Secondly, we say that states use these tools often as symbols of their war effort. When states choose to utilise religion to appropriate religious and cultural objects as a part of their war effort, they make those symbols and sites complicit in that effort. And they make the people who associate with those sites complicit in that particular thing. They consent to having those sites used as targets. We say the French used Verdun Cathedral as a symbol of the fact that the French resistance in the First World War was still winning, and the Germans decimated it and destroyed it, and it hampered the French war effort. It made it a much more difficult war for the French to win, which is of course why they needed us to come along and rescue them. Secondly, we say, even if the religion is not directly implicated within that particular warfare, we say often religious groups and extreme religious groups that are associated with these sites are often the most extreme advocates of warfare precisely because they do not have to go to war themselves. We're going to take an example. We want this to be clear. We're not being offensive, we just think it's true. That some of the most aggressive proponents of the conflict between Israel and Palestine are those religious groups who do not, as a result of having gone to rabbinical school, have to serve in the IDF. These are the people who are often the most extreme, and we think that it's legitimate, if this war is going to be a proper war, for those people to have warfare and destruction brought into their own homes, just as they are trying to subject others for warfare and destruction to be brought into their homes. So we think it's legitimate in that way. Finally, we say that the state and religious sites and religions in general are often intertwined with each other. They form an oppressive nexus. It's why Kropotkin said the world will only be free when the last king is strangled to death with the guts of the last priest, ladies and gentlemen. We say that these sites are a symbol of that religion. They are a symbol of that oppression. They are a symbol of that state nexus. And to target them is to target that state. They are a part of it. Finally, we say that it's legitimate in and of itself. I think I might have burst my own eardrum shouting, so I'll quieten down. We say firstly that the significance that is attached is the same as any other particular site. The rolling fields of the French battlefields, the olive groves of Lebanon, the Westminster Palace during the Second World War. There is nothing which says, apart from the fact that people apply some bizarre sacred profane divisions, that these sites are different. Can you tell me why?
Many people put God ahead of their own lives. Nobody puts the Queen ahead of their own life.
Oh, judges, you can take your own view on that one. We say that this significance is arbitrary. These sites are communal spaces. They are gathering points. They are points of memory. But these memory points are passing. That people still pray in front of the fourth wall in the temple in Jerusalem. They still find that site important. It's not lost forever. And that's what Lisa's going to talk about. She's going to talk to you about the transitory nature of these religious sites and why we don't obliterate them from the historical record completely. So we say that, firstly, that it's going to be helpful in winning the war. It's going to demoralise the enemy, and we say it's legitimate overall. The final thing I think we need to say is that what the opposition really needs to show us is why these sites are so different from any other site. When states use religion, or even if they don't, when that religion is complicit within state actions, why are those particular, why is that, oh God, how do I explain this? Why is it, just 2 seconds. We say that religion is often used as a weapon. It's often used as a weapon in warfare, and that's even when it's not used overtly as a weapon. Why is a religious site any different from an armoury when it's stocking up schools of young radical extremists who want to march into war? But ladies and gentlemen, because we say it's going to win the war, because states are legitimate in targeting them, and because we can't see a reason why not to, we beg to compose.
Really? Shame on you. Okay. Rebuttal. The first prop that it's really neat to bomb churches and stuff because Vandals spend resources defending churches. Now here's an idea. Let's start bombing orphanages because Vandals have to spend resources on defending orphanages or regions or any other form of civil infrastructure. Let's bomb sewage stations, ladies and gentlemen, because Vandals have to defend sewage stations. We say the government simply failed to offered a very ridiculous point on this. We say that if you're going to target everything, if you're going to target churches in order to dilute the enemy's defenses, you might as well target other civil services, and they failed to show, and obviously this point failed completely. The only real justification for targeting religious infrastructure in particular is the particular nature of its effect on morale and so on and so forth. So this ridiculous point on defending sites is just false immediately. Now on to creative rhetorics. Well, yes, the enemy might say oh, okay, you ruined our temple, so God must not exist. But let's look at one particular group that I'm thinking of, let's say Jews, who years ago, by the Romans in the exact circumstance that you have described, and that actually made us remember this day in and day out, and mention the ruin of Jerusalem and the creation of the temple every year for the past 2,000 years. So, suggestion is actually making a symbol of struggle to the other side. Maybe offending the very core of your identity actually makes people hate you for a very long time. Okay, so let's get cracking with some positive, although I'm loving this. Well, okay, first, we go on side of opposition. We contend that what they suggest, the positive they are suggesting, actually constitutes collective punishment. And we'll explain to you why that's awfully bad. Second, we'll explain to you how this causes massive harms to non-combatants, and we'll show you how religion is in fact something that is special and does need special protection. And lastly, we will talk about how some orders are not legitimate and actually consider the soldiers who are going to be ordered to drag the bodies of saints and priests on altars. Okay, so let's get cracking. No collective punishment. Well, I'm sorry that I have to remind you about the Geneva Convention. Actually, it's illegal to punish the general populace for in the course of war. This is illegal to stop water or sewage or medical care or other basic other basic services from citizens in the course of war. You are punishing citizens, civilians who are not army, who are not competent, who are not legitimate targets in the course of wars. This goes against the very basic tenets of Western consensus of justice. You do not harm someone who isn't actually actively resisting you. You do not do that, and by desecrating a mosque, you are doing that to the entire Muslim population. Go.
Can you give us some analysis of what your criteria for legitimate and illegitimate are? It's not the Geneva Convention.
Excellent.
Tell us why we should care about the Geneva
Yes, excellent. Okay, we say that this causes a direct harm to non-combatants that is equivalent to denying them food, water, and medical services. This is our contention on the side of opposition, and we're actually going to try to convince you of that. So, we say the following thing. Religion can be a very, very basic aspect of your personality. Now, you could say, okay, like, I also like film. That's also a basic aspect of my personality. But let's look closer. We say that, like, religion is first something that you hold very deeply in maybe something that you hold very deeply in your heart. Second, that the rewards that you attribute to religion may be much, much vaster and greater in scope than the rewards you attribute to food or running water. Because you think that water may give you like an extra 70 years to live on this not so good world, whereas like having a Muslim symbol desecrated means that you are going to hell for eternity. So you're looking at short-term gains, and a rational actor would actually say that like he's better off being deprived of food and medicine than being deprived of this sanctity of religion. Now, you might say this is crazy because we're like all enlightened Europeans who are largely secular, right? But we pointed Buddhist monks who actually burned themselves in protest of the American occupation in Vietnam. We point to suicide bombers who actually blow themselves up, including civilian populations, just because they were extremely angry at some violation of the religion. So what we say fundamentally, this is a crucial point, is that religion forms an extra need. Just as when you occupy a territory and you need to give extra liberties to certain people, like let's look at Israel and the Palestinians, for example. Like we deprive people who are under occupation from the freedom of motion, right? Their capability to go from place to place is hindered. But if you have a certain illness, if you need dialysis daily, these limitations do not apply. We allow you to go to the dialysis because you have an extra need. And we say that religion forms this extra need. It gives you another sort of food that you need to eat, which may not be as tangible, but is of no less importance. And so we come to the conclusion that food and like sanctity are the things that are on equal grounds, and not like something that is less important or something that can be trivialized as First Gov tried to. Lastly, some orders are not legitimate because the government completely ignored the agents that are involved in the mechanisms they are proposing. They ignored the soldiers. The government is seriously suggesting that we should order soldiers to go and do horrific stuff. Now we say that desecration, stuff that is the act of desecration essentially involves impure things that are so vile that they have survived in the concepts of all men as horrible and something that must not be done. Soldiers are not monsters. They do not like randomly kill civilians. They recognize that in certain situations you may have to kill a civilian in the course of combat because he is in proximity to another combatant. Soldiers are not allowed, and they have been trained not to do stuff to target religious sites or to target civilians in a non-combatant environment. Religious soldiers may be allowed to do extreme things like kill, but they are only allowed to do that in the course of combat, not in the course of like subduing and humiliating an enemy population. For all those reasons,
Now, the opposition just gave themselves a very high burden in the debate today. They told us they were going to prove that desecrating religious sites caused a direct harm to non-combatants equivalent to denying food and water. Now, we on the proposition, ladies and gentlemen, do not think that's the case. And I'm going to be showing you how this action is not equivalent to that action. I'm going to be looking firstly at the question of choice between targets. I'm going to be looking at the question of the historical arbitrariness of which sites are religiously significant, and thirdly, the idea that if this becomes a legitimate tactical war, that actually creates a less dangerous situation. So first of all, on to what we heard initially from Yuri, and he told us that, okay, this is killing someone's religion, because a religion is important to their identity, and, you know, they really care about not going to hell. But ladies and gentlemen, when you, like, destroy a church, you don't destroy the ability of someone to practice their religion, okay? If you happen to desecrate a shrine, it doesn't mean that that person, like, can't worship God anymore. Okay, maybe that argument's applied if we were, like, preventing people from, like, praying. That's not what we're doing, okay? There's, like, a church down the road. They can do it in their own home with, like, icons on their wall. So it's entirely, like, a different situation. And this balance that he set up is therefore just completely talking about something entirely different. He then told us we are ignoring the agency of soldiers. We think they're ignoring their agency a lot more when we order them to go and kill people, which is what we do. And I don't know if, like, God's got his priorities right, but I thought more about, like, murder being wrong rather than, like, attacking the religious sites of other gods. I mean, I thought God was pretty jealous anyway, so I don't see why it would, like, necessarily be a problem for, like, religious soldiers when actually these soldiers who are part of those army are also engaged in the process of killing, murder being one of the things which pretty much across the board in religions people think of as wrong. And then Yuri said, aha, but the difference is that we ask those soldiers to do that in the course of combat. What they ignored was all Ben's stuff about how this is like the action of desecrating these religious sites is a part of that combat. These religious sites are used by the state as a source of giving those states a power. It's a rallying point for that state identity. Like, and it ignored all of that stuff about how, since this is, as we are arguing, supposedly a legitimate act of war, the idea is that it is then part of the course of conduct. So I think that is a false distinction between those two things. And then he said, well, you know, okay, well, I mean, if they can, like, say that it's okay to bomb religious sites in the name of war, then they're saying that we should bomb orphanages instead. Okay, so what did that response do? They said, first of all, it conceded that this is actually an effective tool of war. They said that, you know, the main problem is that we hadn't proven that it was supposedly legitimate as well. Was the whole idea is what I'm going to be looking at. Is there a real distinction between doing something which takes away life and doing something which attacks a historical site? They also accused us, aha, that this will become a symbol of struggle, which actually, like, fits in quite well with Ben's stuff about how these points are rallying, these sites are rallying sites for a state's identity, for the kind of, for their being kind of moralized in war, ready to go to war. So actually, it is a really effective, legitimate target. Okay, so first of all, this idea of choice between targets. So in a war, these combatants, they want to demoralize the enemy, or they just want to be seen to be doing something. And we think it's good if wars can end as quickly as possible because then the fewest number of people die. So if there's going to be a choice of things they do to demoralize the enemy, we'd much rather they do the thing where people don't die in the process of doing that, if they're going to be demoralizing the enemy in some way. And given that, like, the ability to go to religiously significant sites is something that kind of adds a bit of value to your life, but isn't, like, definitely not above that life in the sense you couldn't go and visit them if you were dead. And so we think that if we're talking about a choice between actions we can take to demoralize the enemy, the one that we should do is that we should, you know, desecrate the religious site of it rather than go and bomb their armory or their orphanage or whatever and risk more lives. I also secondly like to look at this idea of, like, the kind of historical, the changing meaning of religious sites. Because when these places are gone, religion hasn't, like, lost something forever. What attaches meaning to these places is very changeable. We reconstruct myths around these sites, so even if people can't visit the sites, like, they still talk about the saints that they were there. They just assign significance to new buildings, and we see that throughout, like, history. Frequently places get destroyed. People don't feel that they've become less religious as a result. They just shift the site of where they attach that religious significance to. So it doesn't make a tangible difference in people's lives if they just switch where they're, like, which saint they're going to visit. Yes.
It doesn't make a tangible difference to a secular person, to a religious person. It makes a hell of a lot of difference.
No, what I'm saying is, listen to me. I'm saying that the religious significance isn't attached to one specific site. It's attached to a religion which has a number of important sites. Okay. So because you are religious, you think that churches have value. If one church is destroyed, you don't, like, lose a sense of your religiousness as a result. And we think that since people aren't very able to switch when they're attaching their loyalties to, that is an important part of that. Okay, thirdly, I'd like to look at this idea of what happens if this becomes a sort of legitimate tactical war and people get used to the idea that it's something that happens. At the moment, what happens is that it's kind of seen as a completely taboo subject, and that people don't really want to talk about it, find it a creepy idea. And then what happens is if someone does go and graffiti the graveyard, it's like, oh my god, this is the most insane thing. The proportionate response is definitely not to go and graffiti their graveyard, but actually to bomb them to the ground, which we think is a much more dangerous state of affairs. We think if this is seen as a legitimate tactical war, it loses that taboo that then makes it seem that the proportionate response is to completely overreact. And obviously, as Ben said, we're not defending a state of affairs where this is always the action that states or combatant groups take against other states. We are just saying that because it is something that is effective, and because it is something that we don't think the opposition have proven to us has a special significance, equivalent to denying someone food and water, that they can't simply defend separating these sites of religious significance out from other potential sites. As Ben talked about, what is the difference between destroying a piece of land and one that happens to have historically been up to this point assigned religious significance, when that religious significance changes very often. So what we've done on proposition today is we've shown you how this is an incredibly effective tactic of war. And if we have a larger number of tools of war in our arsenal, what that means is that wars don't have to drag out so much. Things which help wars end quicker help fewer lives be lost and make these war situations better, so it's effective. We've also shown you how it's legitimate, because it's not the same, ladies and gentlemen, as denying someone from practicing their religion. And even if it was the same, we still think that life is more important than the ability to practice your religion. And so for these reasons, I'd like to oppose.
It physically pains me to have to defend crazy religious Jews in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. But this is what I'm going to have to do, because much of the proposition's case today has been based on ignorance. These are the rhetorics of a secular person. This is the case of a secular team. They have no idea what it means to have religious beliefs, and that's why they told us all that they have told us, and I'll be getting to that in just a second. And I'll have quite a lot of rebuttal, but it will be worth the wait, trust me. Let's take a look at some of the additional things Lizzie had told us. First, she said lastly, she said, First, she said that we agreed to bomb orphanages. Well, as an English person, Lizzie, I would expect you to be able to discern sarcasm, okay? I'm not that quick in English and I'm in Hebrew, guys, shut up, okay? Uri said both are very wrong and unacceptable, okay? Secondly, her last point was that it prevents extremism, because people will say, oh, they desecrated our place, so we don't have to kill them, we can just settle for desecrating their place. I have 3 words: Israel-Arab conflict! Clearly that works in real life, Lizzie. Okay. What else? Demoralization. I'm going to be dealing with that at length in my own substantive material. So finally, the speaker for Nottingham asked us for criteria of what's legitimate and what's not. And I'm sorry, honestly, Dublin. Okay, asked us for criteria. And we say that our premise in this debate is that proposition agrees that some things are illegitimate in war. Some things like bombing orphanages, poisoning rivers, stopping food from reaching civil population. If they don't agree to that, then they are crazy. Okay? But if they agree to that, then all we have to do in this debate is to show you how religion is identical to these criteria. And that is what we were doing. So they told us, Lizzie told us, that food is not as, religion is not as important as food. These are only buildings, and they can go and pray in the church down the street. And these, we say, is the rhetorics of a secular person, because there is no difference between what Lizzie said in the view of a religious person to telling you guys that if we kill the queen, that's no problem, because that doesn't stop you from finding another woman and crowning her. Doesn't stop you from practicing monarchy. It's exactly the same thing. Some people, they agreed that food and water are very basic. For you, food and water are more important than religion, but for many people around the world, faith in their God is more important than food and water. We in the defense of the sanctity of their God. We see Buddhists starve themselves. We see Jews during the Spanish Inquisition that would rather die than convert to Christianity. Okay, to these people, religion was more important than life itself. So if you defend their right in times of war to receive food and water, which is the source to life itself, how can you not defend to give them something that is more important than life itself in their views? And we don't think your personal secular views hold in this debate. Go.
Do you think maybe the fact that they think that religion is more important than life itself means they might surrender and the world...
No, and that's what my next point is going to prove. Actually, my second point is going to prove. First of all, let's talk about... No, I'll do that first just for you. They said it will demoralize, and I want to further analyze the nature of religious belief. Because when does a person surrender and fold? When we hurt him, weaken him, and then he knows he has other things to lose and he's too weak to defend them, so he folds. But when doesn't he surrender and fold? When he has nothing more to lose. Now what we say is, because we have proved to you that religion is above all else for these people, if you defy the sanctity of their faith, and Lizzie made it sound like you're just preventing them from praying on Sunday. No, you're defiling it. We saw what happened with the cartoons of Muhammad in Denmark, okay? It was a damn cartoon. It made them kill people. It made many Muslims kill innocent civilians. It was just a cartoon. So the sanctity, the mere sanctity that you defile is more important to them than life itself. If you made them lose that, then you didn't hurt them just enough in order to get them to fold. You hurt them too much, to the extent that they think that the Holy of Holies, the most important things to them, is lost. They have nothing else to live for. They don't care about anything else. They don't want to fold. They want vengeance. And we see the Israel-Arab conflict as a very good example of that. Obviously, these people have more things to live for. They still have their territory to defend, their children to love, no thank you, their jobs to protect. But when we defile their sanctity, when we draw cartoons of cloud, when we throw a pig leg, stupid Jews, when we throw a pig leg in their mask, I'm sorry, okay? When we throw a pig leg in their mask, they don't care about anything else. We say it doesn't demoralize them. It causes them to feel as though they have been hurt so badly that all is lost and all they want is to retaliate. That's the nature of religious belief. It doesn't cause demoralization. It causes fanaticism. No, thank you, sir. So, and you have to realize that's the nature of religious belief. Now, I know it sounds silly to most of you because we are all secular, but to an extreme religious person, that is reality. One more point. They told us that they go to war against countries, and we suggest that religion are not owned by countries, but rather by population that are spread around the world. Now, we say when a country goes to war, it goes to war in the name of its own citizens. Some of its citizens are members of the same religion they now desecrate. Okay? We say a country has no right to go to war against the values of the same citizen in whose name, in their name, it goes to war. We say when a country, out of order, when a country desecrates a mosque, it commits a crime against its own Muslim citizens. When it desecrates a church, it commits a crime against its own Christian citizens. Those citizens never agreed to it. They never would have agreed to it. We say this is a clear violation of the country's contract with its own citizens, which is completely illegitimate. And I will add one thing more. Not even desecrating a mosque is not only a crime towards Muslims, because religious sanctity is universal. When you hurt religious sanctity, you don't only, it doesn't matter if you hurt a mosque or a synagogue, you don't only hurt Muslims or Jews, you hurt everyone that is God-fearing. And that is completely illegitimate to do that to the citizens of your own country. And on these grounds, we beg to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I begin, I'd like to clarify something. The previous speaker referred to us as the team from Dublin. We're the team from Ireland now. So, what, ladies and gentlemen, are we going to talk about in extending this case? We're going to talk, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, about legitimacy as a means and not an end towards achieving goals. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you about the realities of war. Then I'm going to look at this idea of why not religion. And then this idea of a little bit of analysis of a time when we did this And it worked out quite well. Before I do that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to look at three things, right? They told us, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we bomb orphanages? And I say, maybe we should, okay? That, ladies and gentlemen, is the point. Second of all, ladies and gentlemen, they told us that religion is a need. We say this does not remove your ability to believe. We think that's fine. And they told us soldiers can only shoot during combat. And we say combat and non-combat during a time of war are arbitrary, artificial distinctions. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, they are constantly in combat. Ladies and gentlemen, legitimacy is a means and not an end. We say that things that are legitimate and things that are not legitimate are split by one simple thing. Which list they're on, ladies and gentlemen. Which list we wrote them on. I asked them what their criteria are. I wanted to know why things are on the list. Why were things pushed down on that Geneva Convention? Why should we still believe that their analysis at that time was correct? Maybe second opposition can justify for it. We think the first proposition were quite clear in saying that their criterion for legitimacy was effectiveness. Effectiveness in stopping war to achieve the aims of our war, which is saving lives, maybe, no thank you, or maybe something else like getting oil. Don't care, right? We say, ladies and gentlemen, if they want to draw some amazing analysis to show how this is exactly the same as something else that's currently deemed illegitimate, we say, fine, that should also be legitimate. Don't care. Okay. Second of all, focus. Reality. We heard a lot, ladies and gentlemen, about religion. It's important. Religion, community. Religion is something that people build their lives around. That's why it's different. That's why it's something we shouldn't be attached to. We say, ladies and gentlemen, people build their lives around different things. Some people, ladies and gentlemen, build their lives around their family. Their family, ladies and gentlemen, one of whom has been killed because he was a soldier in that war. Why is that sense of community, that thing that you live your life for, less important than religion? If they say they are both important, we say, well, then you were saying that war itself is illegitimate because it will always destroy something that someone has built their life around. So, thank you. We secondly say, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of their idea of it's wrong to deprive people of food or of water or of hospitals during war. Happens every day, ladies and gentlemen. That's what war is. Maybe you didn't bomb the hospital, but if you can't go to it because there's a battle happening in between you, then you're not going. And we say collateral damage happens, no thank you. Don't care, no thank you. We are fine with it because it leads to the war ending sooner. Right. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, this idea of why not religion. Because they talk, ladies and gentlemen, about the godless English and their rhetoric of the secularism. Team Ireland, ladies and gentlemen, is going to talk to you about religion. What we say, ladies and gentlemen, as religious people, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God's. The state, ladies and gentlemen, is the embodiment of Caesar in this piece of rhetoric. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that the state makes secular decisions. The state deciding what it will and will not do legitimately during war. I'll take a few wives from once in a minute. Is making decisions based, ladies and gentlemen, not on what may happen when you die and you go up to your sky god. No, thank you. But, no, thank him. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, why do we do that? Because the state can't know what happens when you die. The state can't know who's right. They can't know if anyone's right about religion. The state can know is certainty about being alive and not being alive. And we say, if a bit of a piss on a Quran or a piss on a Bible, so that's not offensive, right? Piss on a Bible, ladies and gentlemen, means that people are definitely going to be alive for longer. We say that's what the state makes decisions on, or is that a check job?
Susan, first proposition accepted that they do think it's important to prevent excessive violence to civilians and things like that. They do think that there are limits upon war. You seem to be implying that you think that there are no limits upon communication. Isn't that the
I said it's important to be effective in winning your war in order to achieve the end of your war. Generally speaking, we've taken upon ourselves, and we currently have, and accepted the idea that we tend to wage war in order to stop people dying. We're fine with that. That is the status quo. We're fine with that of the definition of effectiveness, which First Prop brought. Effectiveness, less war, less dead people. Let's talk, ladies and gentlemen, about effects. Because we say, ladies and gentlemen, that there has been a time when we attacked a religious ideology or institution thing during war that led to the end of that war and better end results in terms of less dead people. Listen to this, right? During World War II, at the end of World War II, we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We bombed them with big bombs and lots of people died, right? You know, you could use that example of how, no thank you, a big wrong thing that leads to less dead people is good. But you know what that's also an example of? That was not just an attack on their people, on their lives. That was an attack on the embodiment of their God Emperor, on his authority, on his ability to be a religious figure. That's why it worked so well. It wasn't just that lots of people had died, so they decided they would end the war. They saw, ladies and gentlemen, they saw that an attack on their religion, that in order, ladies and gentlemen, for this to have been allowed to happen, ladies and gentlemen, this was an attack on their religion, and ladies and gentlemen, they decided that they would give up. We think that's good. They said, ladies and gentlemen, people don't surrender in fold when they have nothing left to lose. They keep fighting. We say two things. Number one, they won't lose anything if they're so afraid of losing it that they just surrender right away. Great effectiveness, happy about that. If this is usable as a threat. We secondly say, ladies and gentlemen, due to that example that I just gave you, that's demonstrably not true and didn't happen. For these reasons, we beg to propose.
I cannot think of a more perfect motion to give a team consisting of a war historian and a moral philosopher. Let's play war. Ben and Lizzie clearly said that they wanted to minimize civilian casualties, that this was the overriding goal of their war. They said they would not bomb orphanages. Susan said they would. Jeremy, who's right and why? Lizzie said, life is less important than the practice of religion. You're allowed to kill in war, so anything short of killing must be okay in war. This is crazy logic, right? Rape and torture may arguably often be less bad than death. Rape and torture are nonetheless prohibited and are not legitimate tools of warfare. The reason being because there is a distinction between attacking another person as an enemy combatant and attempting to destroy his very humanity and the constitutive attachments that give him life. Furthermore, we point out to you, Lizzie's point is factually false. For many people, the desecration of a religious site is worse than death. Many Jewish people would rather die than see the Temple Mount destroyed. We don't think that's an inherently rational and wrong valuation. Then what we were told? Well, Susan said, collateral damage just happens, and if it happens, like, unintentionally more, then it must be okay to do it on purpose. Guys, that sometimes, as a foreseeable but intensely regrettable consequence, people can't get to the hospital in war is not an excuse to bomb hospitals in war. And sometimes the accidentally drop a bomb that happens to hit a religious site is different from intentionally going there and pissing in the font. Right? These are clearly not equivalent actions. And even if you don't accept the moral distinction here, the doctrine of double effect, the practical effect of intending to do something very bad is that it happens more often than if you just did it by accident. So that's clearly up, right? Then well, we did this once in the past. We did it at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and wasn't it a great idea? Now, possibly the most atrocious moment in the history of humankind, where the most number of human people have died in a fiery explosion, right? When historical evidence suggests Japan was losing and was going to surrender in a few months anyway. I don't know, guys. You can debate Johnny and the war history on this. I suspect that was an illegitimate act of war. The fact that America did it doesn't make it right. 3-point extension. Why does respecting the rules constraining war matter? In short, war is awful, respecting rules sometimes makes it a little less terrible, and here are 3 reasons why. Firstly, because their policy undermines the respect for the humanity of enemy combatants and leads to mistreatment. Secondly, because their policy prolongs and exacerbates conflicts and heightens them. And thirdly, because it destroys the moral fabric of post-conflict societies. There's a moral distinction here. And moral distinction is between attacking someone as an enemy combatant and attacking them as a human being. Between attacking them as someone bearing a gun against you, who needs to be stopped, but against whom you no longer act once the gun is down. That's why we don't harm prisoners of war. And attacking someone because of him being a particular race, a particular religion, having a particular family, and targeting those facts. That's why it's legitimate to shoot a soldier in a foxhole who's shooting a machine gun at you, but not to take his mother out and torture his mother until he surrenders. Right? This is a basic moral distinction representing your respect for the fellow humanity of the other soldier. We put to you that when you order soldiers to desecrate religious sites, not only is this in itself an evil, it undermines the respect your soldiers have for the fellow humanity of the soldiers on the other side. They see them, no thank you, not as professionals who happen to be on the other side in a regretful activity that will hopefully soon stop, but as people for whom it is right to hate because of who they are. We put to you that the experience of American troops, no thank you, in Iraq shows that it's hard enough not to get people to be racist bigots when you don't do this. Can you imagine what would happen if we legitimated American troops going into mosques and pissing on the fonts, no thank you, and using dynamite to detonate the altars? We don't think we're going to see fewer Abu Ghraibs. We think as a basic fact about human psychology, this is going to make war worse. We think for that exact reason, on Ben and Lizzie's own criteria, we shouldn't do it. Yes, Ben.
Why is this different to bombing important sites to national identity, for instance? Why is it different to bomb religious sites?
No, it's not different. If something is so deeply constitutive of someone's identity that they'd rather die than see the site destroyed, and you're attacking it for no other reason, no thank you, than to break their spirit as human beings, we think that's evil, we think that's wrong. Secondly, we think that their policy is going to prolong and exacerbate conflict because it turns conflict into a war not of people, not of armies, but a war of identity. Bombing the mosque says, we're not attacking you as a Somalian, we're not attacking you as an Iraqi, we're attacking you as a Muslim person, and we will hunt you wherever you go. And that turns wars national, transnational, it widens the scope of war, and it lengthens the scope of war, because people may cease to have a particular government, cease to have a particular army, cease to pursue a particular policy. They are not, for the foreseeable future, going to cease to become Muslims. The one very good instance of this, no thank you, is the Crusades. Because in the 12th century, we thought it was an awfully good way to break the spirit of the Muslim people by pissing on their fonts. And arguably, we're still feeling the backlash. Their policy, right? The third thing it's going to do is it's going to worsen bloodshed and relapses in post-conflict societies. For the exact reason that in many cases, in the sort of fractured societies that we see after a war, the sources of traditional moral authority are often the church and the institution of the church. If, as Ben claims, this is going to weaken the hold of that institution, you're going to weaken the traditional sources of moral authority. This is important because the worst atrocities are never endorsed by a traditional moral code. The killing fields, the Soviet acts of sending people to gulags, every dictatorship prior to embarking on crimes against humanity attempts to suppress and destroy religious institutions because almost universally the traditional moral criteria say no. In a fragile post-conflict society, when you destroy the things that hold a fragile moral environment together, that sustain your traditional identities, you're going to remove those kinds of moral restrictions on human behavior. And we've seen this happen, as when Soviet troops going into Eastern Europe deliberately destroyed religious sites so that they could consolidate their ideological control. We saw this with the Khmer Rouge and the killing fields. More importantly, we see this in Africa, where the destruction of churches and traditional institutional centers of authority lead to relapses into tribalism, legitimate acts of war against fellow tribes, such as eating their hearts in Liberia and Rwanda, as Fred would know. So what have we shown you today? Firstly, right, their policy makes conflicts worse because it makes soldiers brutal and vicious to each other. Their policy makes the conflicts longer, and their policy makes relapses more likely to happen. For all those reasons, and on their criteria, the motion falls.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this would be a good time to associate with the people in the room. I mean, I too celebrate when Yossi Benayoun scores a goal. I too cheers in 1998 when Dan International took the Euro. I relate to small countries beginning with I. We are but peas in a pot against the English oppressor. university school, I realized that when I left school, the religion still existed because it exists in here and in here. But more importantly, what is this debate been about from this side of the house? Well, first of all, we wanted to talk about the legitimacy of war and how war is a very horrible place and horrible things happen. But we think when you try and put a quantifiable notion of what legitimacy is, we think it's extremely hard to do. We think it's in some cases arbitrary. Secondly, we want to look at effectiveness and the end goal, which we see as being the most important thing in this regard. And then thirdly and finally, how the consequences outweigh the benefits. Okay, first of all, war is horrible. Okay, these are things and acts that are happening in the midst of something that's horrifically bad, horrific acts. We say, what is legitimate is what best achieves the end goal. We see the end goal as ending the loss of life. We think that's legitimate. No thanks. We say what this proposition, or this had to prove, was why religion was more important than every other aspect of human life. Or say family, or different examples of things like that. We'd say, first of all, there are certain monuments in countries that do mean that much to people. Maybe Ireland's GPO means that much to people. Maybe, if that was blown up tomorrow, it would mean that much to us significantly. Maybe we would care that much. Why is that legitimate in a course of war? No thanks. We'd say 9/11 meant that much to people. If the White House was blown up, it would mean that much to people. No thank you. Okay, what have we got from the opposing side of the house? No thanks. Well, the first thing we got was, this makes people retaliate. No thanks. This makes people retaliate. We'd say, first of all, in what situation of war ever do the two opposing sides not hate each other anyway? You're not creating more hate, no thanks. You're not creating more aggression. This exists regardless. We think we gave you the example where in Japan, people were in a situation they were so demoralized that war was no longer an option for them. These were single acts that were so devastating to the country as a whole that had that effect upon them. We say, thirdly, though, we are not saying this is our solution for every single situation. We are saying this is an option. Right? Sheng, we give examples of where this doesn't work. We say that's fine. We're not saying every circumstance that we're going to take a piss on Mecca or whatever. We're saying we could use this as an option, and if it ended life, if it ended the loss of life, sorry, it would be legitimate. Okay, we got this idea that it's worse than taking away food because religion means so much to these people. We'd say, first of all, maybe if we blew up Mecca, Muhammad might understand that it wasn't your fault, and you might avoid your stint in hell. Okay? Sorry. No thank you. No. Like, we had this idea that, like, can you imagine asking a soldier to do these kind of things? Like, can you imagine asking a soldier to kill a man? To stick a bayonet in some guy's face? Like, is that worse? Is that different? No. No thank you. Like, we had these ideas like soldiers can only do these things in combat. We say when you're in war, you're always in combat. You're always looking out for these things. This is a war situation. No thank you. We know that religion means a lot to people. We say if Mecca was blown up, sorry, not blown up, if Mecca was lost tomorrow because of an earthquake, would that stop people being religious? Would that mean people kind of went, all right, well, that was a good laugh, let's try Christianity? Like, we even saw they mentioned the cartoons in Denmark. We said this didn't stop people practicing their religion. They're still being religious. We say yes, they're reacting because it's a relatively small act. We say if it was something like, you know, attacking Mecca, it's a lot bigger. But the point is it means something to people. We think it affects them in that regard. No thanks. You actually asked me, like you said, is it okay to blow up orphanages or not? We said the point is, when the end goal is minimizing the loss of life, then maybe it could be legitimate. That is what we're trying to aspire to, and that is what we're trying to prove.
Point of information?
No, thank you. All right. What have myself and Susan talked about in this debate? First of all, we talked about what is legitimacy and when it doesn't actually occur. We think because this line is in some cases arbitrary, because we don't know on which side of the line some things fall, we think the only achievable thing that you can actually say, the only end goal you can put on it, is what you're trying to achieve in the end. We think this is an example of something that could be used in that regard. Okay, I'll take one of you. Go on.
By your stance, it's okay to murder and rape babies if it's effective in war. Is that your moral stance, and how is this consistent with what First Prop told us?
Look. The point is, right, we are trying to end the loss of life. We think doing this to a religious site that means so much to people can affect their morale to that regard that they surrender, or even the threat itself might be enough. We think if that was the case, and we think that we could quantifiably work out that would be the situation, then we think that's a circumstance where that's legitimate. And that's the second idea that we brought to you from this proposition. We said that this kind of threat and this kind of situation affects the population as a whole. Because it means so much to them, it means that they can't fight anymore. They can't react anymore. They're demoralized, they're down. It means something to them. We know how much symbolic gestures and acts of this mean to people. We know that Churchill's words alone kept Britain fighting in the war. No one is denying the significance of symbols and gestures to people's morale. The point we make is that the whole point is we are trying to keep people alive. We'd say when somebody's son is killed, when somebody's family member is out fighting, that can affect them as much. Their family member can be killed in a legitimate war. Why is that different? Why can't someone have their family as their religion? If their family member be killed in war, why can't their religion be damaged and not even removed? Because it's not something you can remove. Okay? This debate is about people and what we do to end the loss of life. And for those reasons, myself and Susan need to propose this.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, before anything else, I have been debating for a long time. It is a true honour and a privilege to follow in this debate one of the most impressive ESL achievements I have ever. In the Korean War at the end of World War II, General MacArthur advocated the use of nuclear weapons on China in order to keep them out of the war. He justified this with the argument that war is hell. Had we used nuclear weapons, it may well have been effective. It may well have been military useful, fulfilling all of the criteria that second prop care about, although first prop accept are wrong. However, the fact that war is hell is no reason to make it even more hellish. We say that we place limits on what can be done in conflict to reduce how hellish and how terrible war is. Surely, ladies and gentlemen, there are few aims in human civilization that are so worthy of pursuit. There are three reasons why we say that this kind of act is illegitimate. One, because of the illegitimacy of the act itself. Two, because of the exacerbation and prolongation of the conflict that it creates. And three, because of the undermining of moral institutions that hold back the worst forms of inhumanity. So first of all, the illegitimacy of the act itself. First of all, do we think such things are needed to help us win wars? Proposition claimed yes. They said that it creates lots of demoralization, for example. I want to know, incidentally, where the evidence for this is. When you look at all attacks on civilians throughout human history, such as the British Blitz, for example, in almost all circumstances that I can think of, it creates unanimity and resistance to those who are attempting to oppress it. I don't see any evidence of that demoralization. No, thank you. We say instead it radicalizes people. It makes them convinced that the enemies against them are not merely foes in a political war, but people who are inhuman, who are their enemies for all time, and who have to be stopped. We say that is not good. We say also, when you create situations in which people have little less to lose, as First Op excellently talked about, you make them more likely to be willing to engage in the worst forms of violence. That is also bad. So we say no need to help the war there. Does it force people to defend things that are really important? Well, yeah, maybe, but that is also true of every civilian target in society. Anything new that you target, you force the enemy to defend. That is not a justification for opening the boundaries, no thank you, to allow anything to be a legitimate target in war. Then they said, well, states in many ways use these things. They use religion, and so surely as it props them up, it's on the table. No, because again, anything in society could potentially be a support for a state's power. That means that anything in society could potentially be on the table under their logic. We also think that that's bad. We also point out that it's not just the state that you're attacking. You attack a religion as a whole. People care about that site who don't even live in the state that you care about. And we say that is also illegitimate. A lot of stuff of that came from First Prop. But then, First Op. But then we also said, in response to their claim, but aren't there lots of other things like this, the following. One, Jeremy said, well, in many ways, 9/11 might have been seen to be an attack on a central thing to a people's identity. I make, ladies and gentlemen, the controversial claim that 9/11 was probably an illegitimate act. Shenwu built on this brilliantly, although it hadn't happened yet, by saying it is not legitimate to attack people in this way.
Warfare is an engagement between people not as fundamental human beings, but as combatants. It is unfortunate that it has to happen, but you do need to defend yourself against people who are at war with you. You do not need to attack their humanity itself by rape, by torture. Every moral intuition we could have tells us that these things are not legitimate ways to pursue war. We see no difference with this. We also say it leads to further mistreatment because it creates an attitude in soldiers, no thank you, whereby they see their enemies as inhuman, they see their enemies as not holding these rights, no thank you, and makes them more likely to infringe upon them. We also say, one more thing, I'll take it in a minute, Ben, that it's also not legitimate to force soldiers to engage in this kind of activity. We see no reason why, as a soldier, I sign up not just for the defence of my country, but the desecration of another religion's most holiest sites. Go.
Why is it that religious sites should be exempt? What is it that's so special about religious sites to identity, which means they should be exempt?
Yes.
Unlike any other
Thank you, Ben. Well, really what it is it's all of the arguments that came in the Ock case. That's why the act itself is illegitimate. But it's more than that. It exacerbates and prolongs conflict. Because the generation of the most radical combatants, the most dedicated combatants, are often those motivated by religion. They are the ones willing to engage in suicide bombing. They are the ones willing to stop no matter what. They are the ones who will never tire of the bloodshed. Getting them involved prolongs conflict. Also, the centrality of religion to people's lives and the permanency of such a powerful memory of violence against you means it's likely that this is going to prevent the causes of war from ever going away. The hatred is always going to be sustained. Lizzie said, well, no, people can just replace these sites with other sites. I say a much more perverse thing will happen. The nature of these sites will change. They will not become places of religious worship. They will become memorials to atrocities committed against the people that were motivated by that idea. We say that if you... No, thank you. We also say that this mobilises people, therefore, into violence. We say, look, interestingly, for example, at why states build military statues and military monuments. We say one of the reasons is to motivate patriotism and hatred of enemies and to get people to fight for you. We think that is not a good idea. No, thank you. We also say that clearly, if religion is such a central part to your life, then merely an assault upon it makes you willing to prolong a conflict even further. Because it is a more fundamental aspect of your life, and we talked about how, throughout the opposition line, how fundamental these things were. It is a more fundamental aspect of your life than, say, a mere political squabble or a fight over resources. We said proposition continuously believed that there couldn't be any claim for the idea that this would be more important than life. We just think that's patently wrong. Finally, we say this undermines moral intuitions that hold back the worst forms of inhumanity, because countries at war are much more likely to, during the war and after it, be subject to atrocities, for example, due to hatred, the destabilisation of societies, and so forth. Atrocities are usually forbidden by traditional moral criteria, and those moral criteria need to be undermined for those atrocities to occur. Religious institutions, whatever their effect, do at least promote traditional moral criteria. They are often a force for stability. Undermining them doesn't help. You can see that and how it's effective for totalitarian regimes and those who want to commit atrocities by looking at the fact that totalitarian states often destroy religious institutions precisely to create a moral environment in which atrocities can more easily occur. We think atrocities are atrocious and we don't think that should be allowed. We say that therefore there is a very, very good reason to do whatever it takes to stop it. Ladies and gentlemen, I finish with a piece of rhetoric. Though the effects of religion are complex in this world, it is one of the most powerful forces that do at least hold in our hidden monstrous inhumanity. We say its desecration, furthermore, unleashes that humanity against other people. The task of reining in the monstrous part of human nature should be one of the most fundamental tasks of human civilization. It is a task we seek to fulfill for all of these reasons. I am very proud to have.